What makes a good goal? That's the question that we're going to discuss in this segment. And as we talked about in the introductory video, we know that goals are first of all to clearly identify the learning outcomes of our lesson. They're also used to guide instruction and for progress monitoring. But in this segment, we're going to focus on the first point, writing goals that clearly identify the learning outcomes. The book Principles to Actions, which first introduced the 8 effective math teaching practices, has this to say about establishing mathematics goals. Effective teaching of mathematics establishes clear goals for the mathematics students are learning, situates the goals within learning progressions, and uses the goals to guide instructional decisions. Notice here there are 3 components. First, goals should clearly identify the math students are learning. Goals should be clear about the type of learning and the depth of that learning. Second, goals should be situated within learning progressions. That means goals should work together, like stepping stones, to build our students' understanding toward all of the learning identified in the standard. And goals should also be used to guide instructional decisions. Everything we say and everything we do should be gauged against the goal. So let's break this down into something we can work with. Learning goals are the most effective at clearly defining what our students should know, the conceptual side, and be able to do, the procedural and application side. That is, our goals should clearly state the mathematical ideas, the concepts, the connections, and the relationships that we want our students to understand. And goals should also identify any procedural understandings we want our students to know. But keep in mind, if our goal is for students to gain a conceptual understanding, then that goal should not restrict students to a single procedure. We also need to make sure that our goal supports the learning in the standard. So our goals need to be standards-based. That is, we write our goals to address and support the learning identified by the standard. And going along with that is understanding where the learning of this lesson fits in the learning progression. Also important is when we're writing learning goals, we want to use action verbs. Things like students will describe, students will illustrate, students will generalize, students will compose. So here's a list of action verbs that's helpful when you're writing your learning goals. I've also included a PDF copy of this that's available on the slide after this video. Also important is how will students demonstrate the learning that's identified in the goal. The action verbs that you use to write the goal determine how students will demonstrate that learning. So when writing learning goals, keep the following questions in mind. What should students know and be able to do? How does this fit in the learning progression? What aspects of the standard is this developing? And how will students demonstrate the learning? Now let's talk about writing a learning goal from scratch. We're going to write a learning goal for an Algebra 1 lesson on solving linear equations. There are 2 standards that address the learning for the lesson, AREI 1.1 and AREI 2.3. AREI 1.1 says, explain each step in solving a simple equation as following from the equality of numbers asserted at the previous step, starting from the assumption that the original equation has a solution. Construct a viable argument to justify a solution method. AREI 2.3 says, solve linear equations and inequalities in one variable, including equations with coefficients represented by letters. Now that we know what the standards say, we need to think about the learning progression here. We need to have in mind what the standards say and what those progressions are when we get ready to write the goals. So where would this learning fall in the learning progression? Well, in middle grades, students have solved simple equations, and they should recall that you must perform the inverse operations, the same operation on both sides when solving for a variable. But in this lesson, students have to go beyond understanding of just applying those inverse operations to solve. They must understand why those inverse operations work. And after this lesson, students will apply properties of equality to solving equations of all types. So now let's get ready to write the goal. Based on the two standards, what should students know and be able to do? Well, on the procedural side, it's obvious. We want students to be able to solve linear equations. So that part's still true. But we also want students to understand the properties of equality and how to apply them. Students should see that the properties of equality are the reason why they can perform these inverse operations. And when they're applying these properties, they need to see that they are creating equivalent equations that have the same solution. So with that information in mind, the learning goals for this lesson on solving linear equations might look like this. Students will understand properties of equality, and students will be able to solve simple linear equations by applying properties of equality and justify each step with the appropriate property. Ta-da! And just like that, we've got a learning goal. Listen, you may be a rock star at writing learning goals, but for the rest of us poor mortals, here's my advice. Keep it simple. Address the learning, but write it in terms that you and your students understand. And don't sweat the small stuff. Your goals don't have to be perfect. As long as they support the learning that's in the standard, you're good. The whole point of this discussion is just for us to be mindful of the learning that should be taking place based on the standards, and for us to be purposeful in using our goals to achieve that learning. And that applies no matter what standards we're operating under. Well, now it's your turn to write a goal from scratch. In this next activity, I'm going to give you a standard and a lesson topic, and I want you to write a learning goal. Just remember, to write a learning goal, you need to make sure you address what students are to know and be able to do. Good luck!